Deep in a secluded valley, where sunlight rarely pierced the canopy of thick pines, there was a town called Black Hollow. It was a quiet, self-sufficient place, with a population small enough that everyone knew everyone else. To outsiders, it seemed idyllic, but those who lived there knew better. Black Hollow carried a weight, an unspoken dread that the townsfolk never talked about. Travelers passing through often described an uneasy feeling, as though the very air carried whispers no one else could hear. The forest surrounding the town had always been a source of unease, its dense, ancient trees looming like sentinels. And then, one night, Black Hollow simply ceased to exist. The story begins with James Marlowe, a trader who had the misfortune of arriving in Black Hollow the day before its disappearance. James was no stranger to travel, and he prided himself on being a man of reason. Superstitions, to him, were nothing more than tales to entertain children. But that was before Black Hollow. The storm had driven James off his intended path. The rain came in sheets, obscuring the road and leaving him no choice but to seek shelter in the nearest town. He arrived in Black Hollow soaked to the bone, his horse skittish as though it sensed something he couldn't. Mrs. Winslow, the innkeeper, greeted him at the door with a strained smile. "We don't get many visitors," she said, ushering him inside. James didn't think much of her nervous demeanor. Small towns often harbored wary folk, unused to outsiders. Over dinner, however, Mrs. Winslow's anxious glances out the window and her cryptic remarks began to unsettle him. "The forest is restless these days," she said in a hushed tone. James raised an eyebrow. "Restless? What do you mean?" She hesitated, her hands trembling as she poured him a cup of tea. "Shadows in the trees. Strange noises at night. People disappearing. The town has been shrinking, one by one, but no one knows why." He brushed it off as small-town gossip fueled by isolation. Yet, as he climbed into bed that night, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. At midnight, he woke to an oppressive silence. The storm had stopped abruptly, and the usual hum of nocturnal life was absent. It was as if the world had been muted. Sitting up, James noticed a faint glow seeping through the cracks of his window. He rose and peered outside. What he saw defied explanation. The forest was alive, its trees writhing as though they were breathing. Shadowy figures darted between the trunks, too quick and unnatural to be human. A thick fog began to roll in, creeping into the town like a living thing. With it came the whispers, a low, disjointed murmuring in a language James had never heard. Panicked, he threw on his coat and ran downstairs, calling for Mrs. Winslow. The inn was eerily quiet. Doors hung open, chairs were overturned, and her teapot sat steaming on the counter. She was gone. James stumbled into the street, shouting for anyone who might still be there. The fog thickened, and the whispers grew louder, filling his ears and seeping into his mind. As he moved through the town, he noticed strange things. A rocking chair on a porch swayed as though someone had just risen from it, yet no one was there. The smell of baking bread wafted from a bakery, its door ajar, but inside, the oven was cold. The deeper he ventured, the more distorted the town became. Houses seemed to twist and shift, their shapes wrong in ways he couldn't describe. The cobblestone paths cracked and warped beneath his feet. Finally, he reached the town square, where the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. In the center of the square stood a group of figures, their backs to him. At first, he thought they were townsfolk, but as he stepped closer, he realized their movements were jerky, as though controlled by invisible strings. One by one, they turned to face him. Their eyes were hollow, black voids, and their mouths moved in unison, chanting in that same incomprehensible language. James staggered backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The fog swirled around him, and the figures began to close in. Desperate, he turned and fled, running toward the chapel at the edge of town. The chapel door stood open, its interior bathed in an otherworldly glow. James stumbled inside and slammed the door behind him. The whispers subsided, replaced by a heavy silence. Inside, the chapel was untouched, as though it had been frozen in time. Candles burned steadily on the altar, and a Bible lay open, its pages glowing faintly. Approaching the altar, James noticed symbols scrawled in the margins of the book, circles, lines, and runes he didn't recognize. Beneath them was a single sentence written in trembling script. "The forest takes what belongs to it." Suddenly, the air grew cold. The chapel doors creaked open, and James turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was Mrs. Winslow, but her face was wrong, stretched and pale, with hollow eyes that leaked black ichor. She smiled, her teeth jagged and sharp. "It's time," she said in a voice that wasn't hers. The ground beneath James began to tremble, and the walls of the chapel seemed to melt away, revealing the forest outside. The shadows surged forward, enveloping him in darkness. When he awoke, James was lying on the forest floor, miles from Black Hollow. The town was gone, replaced by an unbroken expanse of trees. No sign of its existence remained. No roads, no ruins, not even the faintest trace of its people. For years, James tried to tell his story, but few believed him. Those who did ventured into the forest to find the clearing where Black Hollow once stood. None returned. Today, it's said that if you wander too deep into the woods, you might find yourself in a place where the air feels heavy, and the trees seem to whisper your name. Stand there long enough, and you'll hear the voices, the lost souls of Black Hollow, calling you to join them. And if you answer, you might never leave.